All right, so before we get into our plenary panel, I wanted to introduce our moderator, who is from our very own Hopkins chapter. CJ is a third year undergraduate in environmental engineering. He's a secretary of our e-board. So, yes, CJ.
Hey everyone. I hope everyone enjoyed the breakout sessions. I think is my mic okay? Okay, perfect. So I hope that everyone really took advantage of the diverse
Sorry, we can't hear you.
Oh, let me see. Yeah, okay. The handheld. Oh no, it's good. Okay, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Thank you, sir.
Okay, perfect. So my name is CJ, as Ashish mentioned, and so coming back from our breakout sessions, I really hope that everyone took away things from the wide uh, variety of expertise that we had relating to issues ranging from the opioid epidemic all the way to access to insulin. And as a result of that, um, I just wanted to now return the focus of our conference itself into the upcoming panel that we have. And to do so, with our theme, I think it's important that we come back full circle to some of the responsibilities that we have on a global scale. And that means that we should remind ourselves that there are issues bigger than single communities that we're facing throughout all the topics that we discussed today, and but so can our solutions be. And so, in terms of realizing and scaling up some of the very improvements that UAM is working on, it is important to reconsider how development of drugs and vaccine pipelines going to the market domestically affect those in other parts of the world. And to start off this discussion, it's my pleasure to have my former mentor, who actually originally introduced me to this topic, come up and present Dr. Anthony So, Distinguished Professor of Practice at the Bloomberg School of Public Health, who is also the founding director of the IDEA Initiative. And I'll hand it over to him to provide us an overview of some of the terminology and talk about some of the processes that go hand in hand with designing transformative technologies for low resource settings and global licensing. So without further ado, I'll hand it off to Dr. So when he's ready.
Thanks so much, CJ. It's a pleasure to be able to actually kick off this particular panel. And I think it really connects in many ways. Innovation Without Borders really in some ways speaks to how we actually have spoken to many key issues so far in this conference, such as high drug prices, clinical trial transparency, which are building blocks, of course, for R&D, and how do we connect those things together so that, in fact, all of those in need may, in fact, be beneficiaries of the kinds of technologies that we bring forward to the marketplace. And so this builds on that, of course, start from many of the great talks earlier in the day, of course, and many of your experiences, of course, on university campuses. Now, this also goes back to a time in which I alluded to actually in the welcome remarks, of course, at the conference, when some people actually believed that it was not possible to treat patients with HIV/AIDS in low and middle income countries because the price of hope at that time seemed too high at $10,000 to $15,000 per patient per year, too high for a global fund to take on, until it was possible because civil society groups, actors like yourselves, and UAM in particular as well, were able to actually compel various actors such as Cipla, an Indian generic drug firm, to introduce a generic version of antiretroviral therapy at $350 per patient per year. And that, of course, is less than $1 a day, which transformed entirely the possibility of making the ethical decision of allocating, of course, the kind of resources necessary to make it possible for the 25 million people living with HIV/AIDS at that time in low and middle income countries. Now, 20 years since we've actually, of course, struggled over HIV/AIDS drug prices, we still face concerns over affordable access to life-saving drugs, from the latest cancer treatments to the cure for hepatitis C. And the issue of high drug prices is not just one of affordable access, of course, in low and middle income countries, but it also begins also here, actually, of course, in the United States as well. And so if you actually look at, even in high income countries, we struggle with high drug prices. And you've heard, of course, that about in one of the panels, of course, earlier today. Most cancer drugs launched between 2009 and 2014 were priced at more than, in fact, $100,000 per patient for 1 year treatment. I don't know about you guys, but I've had to take a lot of a lot of actually hours actually working in order to actually make that kind of payment just to survive, let alone be alive with cancer and try to survive. 1 out of 5 actually U.S. adults in the United States amazingly took less insulin or delayed buying insulin in 2021 to save money. Now that, of course, tide is changing some thanks to, again, the work of many in the access to medicine movement to try to cap the cost of insulin in this country, but our job is not done for sure, and we have so much further to go on second line, of course, treatments for diabetes. And one of them, of course, is Wegovy, which has received mention, and Ozempic, which, of course, our colleagues at Yale Crit have clearly demonstrated that despite a price tag over $1,000 for the treatment, that in fact, of course, it could be produced for $5. That's really quite extraordinary when you begin asking, what is that gulf, really, between the innovation and the access? And on the right-hand side of this slide, of course, is an important other consideration, which is that for many countries in the world, they rely on the WHO's essential drugs list as a way of modeling their national formularies. What gets actually covered in their national drug programs, in fact, takes cue from the WHO's, of course, essential medicines list. And that's very important because there have been perennial discussions about whether or not, in fact, high-priced medicines will make it onto that list. And even though, of course, we all struggle with the importance of prioritizing those drugs which are going to be most important, the price does make a difference as to how, of course, these drugs might be, in fact, adopted and implemented in these kinds of countries. So part of our challenge is to make sure that, in fact, the decision is not just on price, but in fact on the public health priority and the population benefit that might, in fact, be realized. Now, we might ask, what is behind these high drug prices? And one of the things might be explained that because we in the United States are footing the R&D premium to bring these medicines to market. But we should take a step back and ask ourselves, what is this R&D premium? And is it being paid for already? Are we paying much more than the R&D premium? And a very eye-opening study was conducted by Peter Bach and his colleagues. And they had a study in the Health Affairs which analyzed the top 15 drug companies, well, the 15 drug companies that manufactured the top selling 20 drugs in the world in 2015. And the US drug prices were compared against publicly available pricing in Canada, Denmark, Ireland, and the United Kingdom. And what they found was really eye-opening. Those list prices for other developed countries averaged 41% of the US net drug prices, so less than half. The premium actually earned by US net prices exceeding what other countries paid for these drugs came to $116 billion, which was far greater than, by a large margin, than the $76 billion that these companies spent on their R&D globally on all products. And the authors argued that if the magnitude of the premium paid for by US consumers and payers could have been lowered to a level that matched the global R&D costs across the 15 companies, US taxpayers could have saved $40 billion just in 2015. To put in context, that was a year when the total US spending on pharmaceuticals came to $325 billion. Now, many of us, of course, in public health and medicine, of course, ask, if it's not for then the cost of covering R&D, why this gulf between the marginal cost of producing these products and the astronomically high prices being charged? And you've heard some of course, of the reasons earlier in the day. Monopoly pricing, certainly under various forms of market exclusivity, financialization, where decisions by pharmaceutical firms for merger and acquisition and pricing, as well as, of course, stock buybacks, may not be motivated by innovation and access, but more so by enriching, of course, shareholders and the C-suite, of course, of those companies. But, the next, of course, thing we might ask is, why do we think, actually, that these should be public goods? And part of course, is that I want to unfold it into the larger picture so we understand what are public goods and why do we think actually, of course, these might be public goods or not. Public goods, after all, are defined along two dimensions. A pure public good is non-excludable and non-rivalrous. By non-excludable, we mean that no one can be prevented from accessing the public good, like the air we breathe. Or by non-rivalrous, we mean that actually one person's use does not diminish another person's use of the good, such as knowledge. The knowledge behind these health technologies often may be rooted in publicly funded research, and I'll get more to that in a moment. And so we might reasonably expect that knowledge to be publicly available. However, we know that health technologies that don't today typically come to market that way. After all, they're a combination of really mixed, actually, ways of which they're financed. And that's really a very intentional setup, of course, of how our system works, because we meld public and private financing to bring these, of course, products to market. So they're mixed public goods. For example, if you actually then fill out the other quadrants on this diagram, common pool goods are non-excludable but rivalrous in consumption. Let's give an example. For example, if you were in a forest, it would confer environmental benefits that are non-excludable. But you cut down the forest for timber, that's rivalrous. And so obviously that would not be that would clearly put it into a different quadrant on this diagram, right? If in fact, actually, we talk about that more relevantly to health delivery, we talk about club goods. Club goods are excludable, but non-rivalrous. That is, for example, the benefits can be spread among a subgroup of the population whose membership can maybe controlled by providers of the good. And in the non-health context, of course, a great example is, of course, satellite television or streaming TV, right? All of which has, of course, the characteristic of non-rivalry, because someone's use will not necessarily take away from someone else's use. But of course, you have to be a subscriber, and therefore, actually, in some ways, you move the good that might be otherwise non-excludable to be excludable. The way in which we do that, of course, is intellectual property rights. And so intellectual property rights, in many ways, a regime that has been agreed upon, and I won't get into it, unfortunately, today, or maybe we could do it in the Q&A, but there's a very important reason as to why the intellectual property rights system exists as it does today. Much of it was negotiated at the World Trade Organization during the, of course, enactment of the TRIPS agreement, the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, something I strongly urge you to look back at, because in fact, much of the whether or not you are part of the intellectual haves or the intellectual have-nots in the world depends, of course, on how those rules of governing intellectual property rights work or do not work. So can we make the case, though, and I don't know why in the import, but hopefully you can still see the slide well enough. One of the reasons, of course, why we expect pharmaceutical products to be public goods is that the public pays for these goods, usually twice, upfront for the R&D, and again when we buy the products for the healthcare delivery system. And recent work by Ekaterina Cleary and her colleagues actually documented that nearly every new drug by the US FDA from 2010 to 2019 has been supported by US NIH funding. That's really quite extraordinary when you look at actually what the government has done, your taxpayers have actually, US taxpayers have actually supported. So from 2010 to 2019, NIH funding essentially totaled $187 billion and went to 99.4% of the products approved by the FDA in that period. That's really quite an amazing actually support record. And NIH spent $1.44 billion per approval on basic or applied research for products actually with novel targets. Importantly, most of that NIH funding was spent on basic research as opposed to applied research. And again, this is another very important area of policy to understand. There's a reason why we do more basic research than applied research. Part of it's because there are strong industry influences that have prevented us from doing some of the applied research. So, for example, the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences at the NIH is precluded from moving past phase two actually clinical trials in its efforts, unless they have to go through special hoops to make sure that, in fact, the private sector is not doing it. There are other, of course, barriers that are actually statutorily placed in that, in fact, don't allow us to go the last mile to market. And, of course, you've already heard earlier today, up until the Inflation Reduction Act, we, of course, were even precluded from negotiating, actually, for Medicare, actually, the prices of some of these products. So there are a lot of forces at work here, but important to realize is that the spending from NIH was not less than industry spending, with the full cost of these investments calculated with comparable accounting. So if we are making such contributions to pharmaceutical R&D, are we good stewards of the resulting products if they're priced too high to actually be accessible to those actually to whom we as taxpayers had hoped to actually support and enable health benefits as returns on investment? Much like the CEO of a private company, how well do we manage our public sector investments? After all, is not the government the equivalent of a CEO who has shareholders, namely the citizens of the country, and if not, of course, even broader aspirations of providing global access? Now, there are four methods by which such, of course, problems in the marketplace have been traditionally dealt with. I'm going to provide this as a framework, as a part of the overview, really, for the rest of the panel as well, because it helps us actually understand many of the policy efforts. And then I'll come back to actually really a new vision of how we put these things together in a way that's more systematic to create access, because pricing is just simply a symptom of the problem actually of our innovation access system. If you have high prices that deny people access to the very products for which they are intended to benefit, then we have a dysfunctional, of course, R&D system. And the question then becomes, not how do we patch and fix certain parts of it that are broken, but how do we re-engineer it in a way that it more consistently brings forward the products of those in need. So I will talk briefly about tiering and pooling, which are ways in which to actually aggregate different building blocks of knowledge and to make certain building blocks of knowledge either more available or not. And then there's what I call push and pull financing, which are, of course, to pay for inputs and outputs of R&D. So just briefly on each of these areas to give you a flavor of the kinds of approaches taken. So tiering really sets different conditions of access for different market segments. It offers a way of ensuring pharmaceutical return on investment while at the same time increasing access to medicines in developing countries, particularly. This works primarily, though, for medicines that have what we call dual markets. That is, markets are both profitable in high-income country markets that can be sustained, but you can have closer to marginal cost pricing, which is, of course, preferential pricing in, of course, resource-limited markets, like those in low and middle-income countries. Now, we've had to rely on tiering, at least for prices, to help make medicines more affordable within the reach of the poor, like in our vaccine markets, for example. However, it is voluntary on the part of the originator company. It requires product by product, of course, negotiation, and can be quite inconsistently applied. And so while many vaccines, for example, are publicly funded and are priced lower in developing countries, those, of course, arrangements are vaccine by vaccine, and they don't necessarily hold. For example, as the Health Justice Initiative in South Africa recently actually successfully, through the South African courts, forced the South African government to release the contracts with vaccine manufacturers, we discovered, quite amazingly, that Johnson & Johnson was charging 15% more actually for the COVID-19 vaccines in South Africa than they were for the European Union. And had the Serum Institute's similar arrangement had gone through, that also would have been true of the Serum Institute's, in fact, COVID-19 vaccines in South Africa. Importantly, so we then can recognize that tiering, particularly in this voluntary negotiation approach, doesn't exactly leave the public sector in an advantaged position to actually safeguard equity, because tiered pricing does not equal equity pricing unless, of course, it does reflect this difference actually in resources between the different segments of the marketplace. So let's turn now to the other approach, which is pooling, which we will connect to a number of major, of course, undertakings that some of you may be familiar with. So many health technologies, of course, require combining several building blocks of knowledge, several components to make a diagnostic, drug, or vaccine. For a diagnostic, this might be the platform technology for a diagnostic. You need biomarkers, though, of course, to make the genetic diagnosis, and you need reagents to run the test. For a vaccine, this may include, of course, not only, you may need antigens targeted by the vaccine. You may need an adjuvant to boost immune response to the vaccine, and so on. Multiple components. For a disease like HIV/AIDS or TB, you may require cocktail drugs and used in combination to treat effectively. And it was this combination, of course, therapy required for HIV/AIDS that led to the creation of the medicines patent pool, whereby originator companies could license their patented drugs for HIV/AIDS, and now under other indications, to the medicines patent pool. And in turn, these can then be cross-licensed to generic companies that could bring triple therapy to treat HIV/AIDS to market, including things like pediatric formulations that perhaps were not of sufficient market interest to, of course, the main manufacturers of the originator drugs. So, but if you give it to generic companies, they may find it actually quite profitable to put the licensed products together and provide that pediatric formulation that otherwise would not be served in the marketplace. So during the pandemic, of course, the World Health Organization created its own pooling mechanism for the COVID-19 health technologies. And through the COVID-19 Technology Access Pool, or CTAP, it was a struggle, of course, to actually get any of the health technologies licensed. More on diagnostics, but took almost 3 years before the first commercial COVID-19 vaccine was licensed by CTAP. And I will say, by actually, of course, a disclosure, I was on the CTAP's technical advisory group for WHO, but what I say here, of course, only reflects my personal views. But importantly, of course, CTAP represents, in my mind, a remarkable, though advance, nonetheless, despite the limited, of course, the limited gains it could secure from the pharmaceutical industry, particularly on the vaccine side, that was reluctant to license to the pool. And that was importantly that along the way set the precedent for public research agencies from the NIH here in the United States to the Spanish, of course, National Research Agency to provide publicly funded inventions and license to CTAP for global non-exclusive licensing. And that is really remarkable. And what's really important about it, it was housed at the WHO. Why is that so important? Because the World Health Organization, backed by member states, is the one key way by which, of course, public funding can be well aligned with our goals. They are involved also in providing disease management guidelines, in pre-qualifying manufacturers, in providing technical assistance to the scale up of these technologies in country. So the policy instrument pooling intellectual property rights being housed at the WHO gives it a normative impetus that actually is not available in the medicines patent pool. And that distinction is important. As important, of course, to support these kinds of efforts. And now the WHO, to its credit, has taken it one step further. So in the wake of COVID-19, they're now talking about the Health Technology Access Pool, or HTAP, which was announced in principle a number of weeks ago. And we hope to hear about more details going forward. But that's going to be incredibly important for people in our community, because that is the future vehicle by which these kinds of licenses might be best positioned from our universities, from our public health research funding, our publicly funded research agencies, so that we can have a channel to provide global non-exclusive licensing to those who may want to build upon the innovation globally. Now, let me turn, of course, to financing, because we did have aspirational ideas of how financing globally might be done differently, not necessarily actually in this fashion. I have 20 minutes, right, total. Right? Okay, just want to be sure. So it's financing. So on the push incentives, one approach is to use push incentives, paying for inputs of R&D. And the usual push incentives are things like R&D tax credits or more public funding for research. But more recently, we have seen also more creative ways of strategically using public sector funding. But if there's push funding, there's got to be pull funding. And pull funding, of course, pays for the outputs of R&D. And this is where the pharmaceutical industry is generally more focused on, because you oftentimes will see this in the form of higher reimbursement rates, which also should count. But also, in addition, of course, extended market exclusivity, like monopoly pricing extended through either extended patent periods or, of course, data exclusivity or market exclusivity through regulatory agencies. Now, importantly, of course, there is typically not much effort to adjust downward the pull incentive just because we put in more money up front as a public sector. So there's no extra bonus that we adjust for if we actually are publicly financing something. But that's something, again, perhaps we should be thinking about, And importantly, also, there's not much clarity oftentimes whether or not we're approaching close to marginal cost pricing. Too much of the discussion is over value-based pricing, which again, I would urge many to think much more deeply about, whether value-based pricing really makes sense in a global context. Because ethically, a person who dies actually in an intensive care unit in the United States may avert a lot of healthcare costs, but the same person dying with a disease in Malawi will just die without actually, of course, nearly the same level of expenditures. How does a value-based pricing system really address these kind of global inequities? So importantly, there are many, of course, ways in which this has been creatively applied by industry. And so let me just advance a little bit more just to show you, of course, the push and the pull on these slides. Now, I want to bring this all together in the last few slides, and that is the end-to-end approach really involves actually new mechanisms that we're seeing arising on the global front. One of them, of course, is pull procurement through global, like for example, through the Global Drug Facility. And the Global Drug Facility is a great example of this because it provides a one-stop shop for TB commodities. And it does a number of things for actually manufacturers. It provides them the surety of potential demand by using demand forecasting and providing, of course, the financing of course, of pulling together what might be bought in the next few years. And by doing so, it enables even markets that have very few patients by comparison, the opportunity to actually have manufacturers say, we're going to go the distance because we know that the next few years we will have actually a market for that product. And that has been really critical they get concessionary drug prices as well in those kinds of exchanges, which means, of course, we get a better deal, hopefully for patients. This is, of course, happening and in other places too, like the Apollo Revolving Fund, which is part of the WHO's, of course, office in the Americas, as well as, of course, at UNICEF. Important actually as an instrument, of course, for this area. A second area that we want to talk about just simply is the whole now new emerging discussions over local production, which is, of course, any of you who followed the COVID-19 discussions, Africa is all about discussing right now. How do we actually ensure regional and national health security through local production? Because otherwise, we won't have the ability to, in fact, source the very products we need in things like pandemics, emerging outbreaks, and even the routine endemic diseases we face. And here, importantly, there are several different models. Government-owned production that could be done, for example. You have a number of countries, like, for example, in Brazil, Biopharma Ginkgos provides a substantial fraction of the vaccines in Brazil. So you have state-owned manufacturers. You have a hybrid version, of course, where we could have, of course, government contracted production or an R&D, and that is also something that can be considered and is in a number of places done. And the third approach is really emerging more recently, including the United States, and this is the one also to watch on the US front, and that's CivicRx, which is really a nonprofit generic drug company led initially by Intermountain Healthcare and other healthcare organizations and several foundations. And they initially said they were going to prioritize generic drugs that met several criteria. Those that are on the WHO central drugs list, saw a price increase of 50% or more, or face shortages. And these members of the nonprofit generic company then have actually no rationale to, of course, do pricing beyond marginal cost. They would want as close to marginal cost pricing as possible, which is really extraordinary. And so as a result, actually, the first two antibiotics, the first two drugs they actually put forward were daptomycin and vancomycin. So this is an exciting new model to bring things to market. And so on my final slide, I just want to say that this kind of approach is not novel. In fact, at the dawn of the antibiotic age, we might recall the story of penicillin. Over a decade after Fleming's discovery of penicillin, encountering slow progress in Britain to produce the drug, Howard Florey came to the United States, and with the support of a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation. And here, our Office of Scientific Research and Development at that time did three key things. One was they made actually the availability of corn steep liquor for the scaling up actually of growth media as a growth medium of penicillin as a mold, which was critical. Second, they actually range for overcoming industry concerns of antitrust by allowing the companies to collaborate. And third, they importantly made it possible actually to offset the risk by providing essentially $75 million, a princely sum at that time. Importantly, a small firm then called Pfizer had a particular key actually process called the innovation of submerged fermentation that enabled the scale up of penicillin. You could grow them actually instead of in these large actually things, you could actually grow them in submerged fermentation, much deeper vats. That actually allowed, of course, later Merck, of course, and Squibb to continue the work of this using the same technology for streptomycin. But importantly for penicillin, it meant that it was produced as a generic drug by multiple firms, which multiplied the volume by over 70-fold, and the price fell from $200 per million Oxford units to 50 cents. And while no one's suggesting that we can repeat the history will repeat itself, importantly, this was actually an early, of course, example of how we could innovate without borders. Actually, and I would say that our time today demands no less than this kind of collective action. So with that, I hope this is a useful overview to, of course, many of the issues that we face together. Thank you so much.
Okay. I just want to thank Dr. So again for giving such a great overview of how the landscape of research and development has been shaped up. And in the meantime, so we're going to transition over to a presentation by Dr. Kishore Wasan, who is a distinguished professor at the University of British Columbia, where he will be talking about some of the real-world implications of some of the practices and processes that Dr. So just outlined. And so in that case, we'll be shedding light on kind of what R&D on the global market looks like in terms of a specific drug being brought. That talks about kind of some of the research that Dr. Wasan conducts in lipid-based drug delivery. So without further ado, we're going to hand it off to Dr. Wasan.
Well, thank you very much. I'm just trying to get the share screen here to work. I'm not able to share my talk. See, it was working a little while ago, but Technical challenges from Vancouver. Thank you for having me, by the way. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. Let's see if not, I can have someone there just move my slides.
Okay. Yeah, so we should be able to share this screen from our end. So we'll just do that for you.
Okay, why don't we do that? And I'll just say next slide and go from there. My apologies. It's technical, always technical challenges with, there we go. Thank you so much. All right. And I'll just say, Justin, I'll just say next slide. So I hope that's okay with everybody. So UAM, thank you for having me. I wish I was in Baltimore. First of all, my apologies for not being there. It's Easter weekend, and I'm being inducted into my church tonight. So I'm very excited about that. And I would have loved to have been there. And I want to thank, first of all, the UAM organizers at Johns Hopkins, as well as to Justin, who's an awesome guy, for having me. And Dr. So gave a great talk because, I'm a pharmaceutical scientist and a research scientist. And I've got to tell you that for most of my life and career, I've been a self-serving, greedy, foolish, kind of man that all I worried about as a pharmaceutical scientist was trying to make profit from the technologies that we were developing. And but that all changed with the story of our work with amphotericin B, and ultimately how we started the Neglected Global Diseases Initiative at UBC that I hope to impart on you today in this short presentation. So next slide, please. So what is amphotericin B? So amphotericin B is a polymacrolide antibiotic used in the treatment of blood-borne fungal infections and parasitic infections. And it's a very effective drug. However, its use is limited by dose-dependent nephrotoxicity, the fact that you have to give it as an IV infusion into patients. It's not a cost-effective, it's not cheap, and you have to have trained personnel, and it's not tropically stable. So physicians at Vancouver General Hospital, I was giving grand rounds back in 1999, said, Keish, can you and your lab develop an oral formulation of amphotericin B that we could give prophylactically to patients prior to them going in for transplant? So they became immune compromised, they were getting systemic fungal infections, and instead of having to come into the hospital for IV parenteral amphotericin B in advance, could we give them something prophylactically that they could use at home? So I went back to the lab, and we guys developed an oral formulation of amphotericin B, and we did the fancy patents. I went ahead and filed my provisional patent. We did all the systemic fungal infection work in my lab. We were going to form a company. I was going to make millions of dollars, and I was going to be able to retire as a rich professor somewhere on a tropical island. And we published our papers. And then one day, I had a young medical student who, by the way, was running our UAM chapter at the University of British Columbia, that came to my office and said to me, Keish, have you thought about working with amphotericin B in this devastating parasitic disease called leishmaniasis? I went, leishmaniasis? And I was totally embarrassed, colleagues, because I said to myself, what is leishmaniasis? And on top of that, it turns out leishmaniasis is a devastating parasitic infection in the developing world in my home motherland country of India. And of course, I'm from Indian background, and my mother was all over me going, you need to do something good with your life, Kishore. You're not going to even help people and save people's lives in India with this disease. So I Googled madly, what's leishmaniasis? Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, systemic fungal infections. Next slide, please. So what is leishmaniasis? So leishmaniasis is a parasitic infection that stings you. It's the sandfly that is found in tropically diverse countries. But even though we're now seeing leishmaniasis in the United States because of climate change, this sandfly comes along and stings you and releases this parasitic infection that primarily goes into the liver and into the spleen. And if not treated, can lead to devastating deaths. And these numbers I've given you on this slide are probably wrong and underrepresentative of what's happening. We're talking millions of people having this infection, and it's a hotspot, particularly in South Sudan, in Eastern Africa, and those parts of the country and the world, and a very devastating disease. Next slide, please. So the current treatments are liposomal amphotericin B, miltefosine, and paromomycin. And you can see the issues with each of those products. And so what the UNAM student, medical student said to me was, can you use oral amphotericin B that's cost effective, that's safe, that's tropically stable, that could be used to address the limitations of VL that each of these different drugs have? Liposomal amphotericin B is very effective, but it's not cost effective, and it's not tropically stable, and you have to give it as an IV infusion, and patients are not going to be able to be accessing that. Miltefosine, which is the only oral drug on the market for VL, all right, is toxic, particularly with women of childbearing age, and it's not got tropical stability. And parabomycin is a nasty aminoglycoside that is used with IM injections and just not accessible. Next slide, please. So if we can develop a formulation that overcomes the limitations of parenteral administration that led to loss of income, increased cost of administration, increased risk of side effects, and decreased availability, then we might have something here. Next slide, please. So long story short, with the funding for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we were able to show that our oral formulation of amphotericin B called ICO 009, no, back slide, please, go backwards, was very, very effective in reducing the parasitic load. Next slide, please. And this is a poster that we published a number of years ago with the consortium and colleagues at UBC, showing that we had a tropically stable form and that we were able to reduce the parasitic load in animals at a very non-toxic dose. Next slide, please. And we've now completed phase 1 clinical studies, phase 1A single dose and phase 1B multiple safety studies showing the safety of our formulation in patients with our oral formulation. Next slide, please. So we've got this proprietary blend of monodiglycerides with FDA-approved GRAS exponents. They are affordable lipid excipients. They're easy to formulate and scale up, and we have tropical stability. Next slide, please. And so what are the major advantages of this? Easy to administer, decreased cost of administration, lack of infusion toxicity, lack of kidney, liver, and GI tox that is usually associated with AMP. Increase accessibility to people, particularly in rural and poor countries, and it's a thermally stable formulation. Next slide, please. And just recently, in this fall, the WHO's Pediatric Drug Optimization Group has now prioritized our oral amphotericin B for further development in children with VL. And we're currently now working with WHO and other and global health groups to try to develop this at or below cost for developing world indications. At this point, I said to myself, you know what? We don't need to make profit here. We need to follow the spirit of UAM and develop this technology to make a difference in people's lives. Next slide, please. So what are these neglected global diseases, and why is it important to develop initiatives around that? And this is a very famous quote recently from Pope Francis. Neglected tropical diseases and neglected people, if the opposite of love is not hate, it's actually indifference. And that really defines these neglected diseases. These neglected diseases are really neglected people. And there are 21 infectious diseases which increase poverty and occur in the poorest regions of the world, often in tropical areas, in war zones and remote areas. And there's more than 1 billion people that are affected, primarily women and children, unfortunately, and they're neglected because there's limited funding, research, and treatments. And the idea here is we want to develop them at or below cost for developing world indications. Next slide, please. So why are they neglected? They're neglected because the proportionality between the disease and between the magnitude of the disease and the amount of resources that are put into funding this work is completely out of whack. I mean, we got millions of people that are affected with these types of diseases and very little investment into that. Next slide. So what can universities do? What can we do to make a difference? How can we have the poorest of the poor share in university discoveries? And what we found was that the University of British Columbia and many other universities, there was great research going on, but it wasn't being translated. And everyone was setting up a company. So I went to my vice president of research and I said, is there a way we can do an environmental scan of what's happening at UBC with people who are doing technologies in this area? And what we need is we need mechanisms to encourage and fund expensive research and development for neglected diseases. We must protect these discoveries early, but most importantly, we need to be able to deliver it on the ground. It's great to have great new standards of care and new technologies and new diagnostics and new drugs in an ivory tower, but if they don't make a change in the standard of care on the ground, it doesn't mean anything to anybody. Next slide, please. So we developed the Neglected Global Diseases Initiative at UBC, and we started our Neglected Disease Initiative about 15 years ago. And our mission was to develop interventions for neglected global diseases and ensure that they're delivered to those in need. And we brought together people from bench science, biotechnology, pharmaceutical sciences, health, law, social policy, working together to generate affordable, life-sustaining medicines, diagnostics, and standard of care to make a difference in the developing world and in low and middle income countries. Next slide, please. And in UBC, back in 2007 and 2008, thanks to our local UAM chapter, we were the first in Canada to develop global access policies. And our policies and our procedures are that technologies would be developed at or below cost for developing world indications so that we could make a difference in the developing world. And we try to get people, researchers, and others at our university to sign on to these principles and move their technologies forward under this global access health equity policy and procedures. Next slide, please. So how did UBC respond? Well, luckily, we have a great technology transfer office, the University Industrial Liaison Office, and our Neglected Global Diseases Initiative worked hand in hand together to start to find the funding, to try to find the partners, to try to find, Dr. So makes a great comment about, you've got to build a network of people so that, you can find the resources and have the right connections in the developing world and in low and middle income countries that can help you to move things forward. Next slide, please. And how did we do? Well, as you know, UAM, you have a report card, and we have done very well in your report card on 3 different occasions. On the first report card in 2013, UBC was ranked number 1. We got an A-. We weren't perfect. We had a number of things to do, but we're very proud of the report card. In 2017, we again were ranked near the top. And in 2023, we were the top Canadian university when it came to the University Global Health Impact Report Card. So we're making impact, but we're not perfect. And Justin will tell you from his report that, and your team's report, that we have had cracks in our armor that we have to work on to make a big difference. Next slide, please. So what we want to do is develop interventions for neglected diseases and ensure the delivery to those in need. Next slide, please. And so this is a poster we just presented at the American Society for Tropical Medicine meeting, but also this has now turned into a publication that we just published in December of this past year in Frontiers in Pharmacology, which highlights the 15 years of implementing global access principles at the University of British Columbia. And you're welcome to look at the slide and look at the publication in Frontiers in Pharmacology. We give you examples of different projects that are now under this policy where we're making a difference. And we have a wide range of projects, from work in COVID-19, in work in sepsis, to telemedicine, to antimicrobial resistance, to the work in malaria, to the work in leishmaniasis, as examples of the kinds of technologies and the kinds of diagnostics and the kinds of work that we're doing where we're developing it at or below cost for developing world indications to make a difference in those parts of the world. Next slide, please. What else can we do? And this is a picture on the top left corner of one of our former students, Jennifer Choi. Jennifer was really instrumental in making us move NGDI and UAM forward. She's now since subsequently not only finished her microbiology and biology degree, but she actually went on to law school and is actually now a lawyer and is involved actually in the intellectual property side and the patent pool aspects of it. Because as Dr. So correctly said, we have to have practicality in how to move things forward. We have to have practicality in how to not only get our discoveries out there, but be able to use intellectual property properly to help move things forward, not just to make huge profit. So as I say in this last slide, we want to advocate, educate, and participate. Collaborate outside your discipline and help to initiate your own neglected disease research. And I would throw out the last thing. It's your generation that makes a huge difference in caring for people in these kinds of issues with climate change and neglected diseases and so on. My generation has failed in this respect, and it's your generation. My son is probably the age of many of you out there. I mean, you care about the world in a lot different way than we did. And so we want to use NGDI as a potential mechanism and model for other organizations at universities to try to inspire our students to be the champions of the next generation. And with that, thank you so much for your time. And I hope, if nothing else, we've inspired you to think about the kinds of things you can do at universities. Thank you so much. I don't hear any clapping, so I assume I did okay.
I can assure you that there was a lot of clapping.
No, it's okay.
Everyone in
I'm
the
not
room.
trying to be arrogant. By the way, my apologies to everyone out there. We heard about the Baltimore bridge that collapsed, and we have bridges out here, and so we're of course very worried about our infrastructure. So our prayers to everybody that's been affected by the bridge collapse in your part of the world. But thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Yep. And we'll be going on with that after we get through our next two speakers. But just to rehash, we really appreciated you bringing the story of amphotericin B to life, as well as how you got involved in the Global Neglected Diseases Initiative. And so with that, then, next up we have, I'm proud to introduce to you all Heather Vedot, Executive Director of the Male Contraceptive Initiative, who will be sharing her insights on the successes and roadblocks associated with scaling up male contraceptive products. And Heather's expertise in this field provides valuable perspective on advancing innovation in birth control, a subfield of healthcare that has gradually seen new innovative approaches to making its technologies more accessible to the public. So to better describe her role at MCI and its mission to increase visibility for these issues, I will hand the mic over.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I have to say this is one of the most nervous presentations I've had in quite some time, because I feel like I realized as I was writing this and refining it this morning that I feel like I'm actually here to put out an invitation to collaborate and to present what I think is an opportunity for this community to really help us shape how male contraceptives are manufactured and distributed in the world. I'll get into that. I'm going to put out a couple of disclaimers. First of all, there's going to be some topics that I sort of just blatantly put up here. I was telling Justin, this is my first time feeling like I get to say the quiet stuff out loud. So it's a little unusual for me to be as candid. So everybody in my office was laughing because I kept showing the slide over and over again. I was like, I get to put in this little animation about affordable. So I'm going to run through some quick technical stuff. I'm just going to assume most folks don't have a lot of familiarity with the state of male contraception, because not many people do. So basically, we're still working on a major challenge for the contraceptive community more broadly, which is the nearly half of all pregnancies around the world every year are unintended. And as we know, the primary offerings for females or with people with uteruses are hormonal methods. So one of the unique opportunities that we have at MCI Male Contraceptive Initiative is we focus exclusively on non-hormonal male reversible contraception. So the current options for men are virtually non-existent, still working with condoms and vasectomy. And there's a real need, and I'll get into that in a second, for more options. So I think everybody who works in public health tends to think that they are the center of the Sustainable Development Goal universe, but we made a slide. So really we see, addressing unintended pregnancies as a root means of addressing all of the Sustainable Development Goals, simply just by allowing people to plan to have the size families that they really do want to have. Preventing unintended pregnancies is just a really powerful way to influence the society globally. So we feel very strongly about that. So quickly, a little bit about MCI. So this is our 10th anniversary this year. We were established really in 2004 around advocacy and awareness building around male contraception. And in 2017, we received our first tranche of funding to be able to do grant making. So we started out primarily as a grant making organization. So as we've done that, we've found ourselves, so we are now a bustling group of 7. Before that, there were 3 of us that were working on this, 1 scientist and 2 public health people. And so we realized, okay, we can do pass through and just do grant making, or we can take the public health skills and passion that we have and use the rest of the time, so to speak, to work on that. So how that's grown in the 6 years that our team has been working together is into this network map. So we've really worked hard to bring the partners together. It's, as you might imagine, a very small space. It's, I feel like, really unique in how collaborative and how deeply collaborative the product developers are because of the lack of funding. People are sharing IP already, so it's very much a ripe environment for innovating how products are developed. I got ahead of myself. So this is our big approach. So we do funding and supporting of research and development, and then we do advocacy, which primarily has been public engagement. We are getting a little bit more into policy advocacy. Here's a quick view of the pipeline just to demonstrate that there is a robust pipeline of products in development. We have a few products that have actually started into phase 1 clinical. So things are really bubbling up. Again, sorry to breeze through these. My slides can be shared, no problem, after the fact if folks are interested. This was a pivotal data set for us to get because I joked that on my tombstone, I was going to have the words carved, men will use it and women will trust them, because the global health community had sort of just carte blanche dismissed the fact that there was a need or an interest in male contraceptive methods. And really it's because we've, since the advent of the pill, contraception's been pretty much inextricably linked with women's rights, and women's autonomy to do what we've all done, get educations, build our careers and time our families in a more controlling manner. So we sort of left men behind in this conversation. And so really what we're talking about, we're trying to break the distinguishing language between male and female contraception. So it really is just adding to the true contraceptive method mix, because right now women have the primary responsibility for preventing unintended pregnancies. And by bringing men in, it allows everyone to have their own reproductive autonomy and for couples to even have greater opportunity to control the size and spacing of families, or if they want to have children. A big part of this, as I said, was getting this international market data. So I know there's a lot to see here, but basically, and I'm going to reference back to this in a second. So the yellow line at the bottom, these were data sets of about 2,000 men in Kenya, Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, the US, Vietnam, Bangladesh, and the DRC. The US is the bottom line that you see there. And the really interesting part is the dotted line that comes down. So basically the data were summarized such that it was a discrete choice activity because there are no methods currently available. So it was sort of describing what kind of methods could be available. And then when they got to the end of the survey, it was like, okay, so you have this method in mind of what you could use. If this were on the market, how soon would you be willing to use it? So that dotted line down indicates where the men that were surveyed said the time period that they would use these products. So that's within 12 months. So you see 76% of the men they overlap there. I think it is actually both Nigeria and is it Cote d'Ivoire? Bangladesh, sorry, would use the products within a year. So 76%, that's a huge percentage. And yes, I know that these sort of predictive data have their issues, but it's not inconsequential that these numbers are so high. So we'll get back to that, but it demonstrates there's a need. So this is really what I wanted to get to where I start talking to you guys. So we have a need, which is a need to address the global unintended pregnancy rate. We have a solution, which is to develop more methods of male contraception. We have an engaged ecosystem coordinator, a robust product pipeline, and we have a global market. So the question that is under the little thing there is, why don't we have more male contraception? So it's because the pharmaceutical industry is neither funding nor prioritizing contraception, But in all fairness, neither is anyone else. So contraception is grossly underfunded in the world of drug development, and male contraception, excuse me, even more so. So we heard Dr. Magunga earlier talk about how much money the NIH puts into drug development, and we've heard it in other areas throughout the day today. So the NIH is the largest funder of male contraception. And I'm proud to say MCI is the second largest funder of male contraception. And it's also powerful for me to say that because we only fund 1.5 million in grants every year. So that is not even a rounding error on most drug development programs. So it's really important to recognize that that a lack of funding is the first problem. So this historical precedence around this, and it's been so interesting hearing all the conversations from my colleagues today, is de-risking, tiered pricing, and market shaping. So my background is focusing more on bringing contraceptive methods to low and middle income countries, increasing access to a wider variety of methods. So that's the lens I bring into developing male contraceptives as well. So the pharmaceutical industry has been out of the contraceptive game for decades. So what happened is the development sector stepped in to fill that void because these were populations that they were trying to serve. So they wanted to provide longer acting methods in particular because of the populations they were serving that didn't necessarily have access to clinics. So this is something that's been going on for decades. So the most recent advancements in contraceptive products were actually developed through phase 3 with funding from public and philanthropic agencies primarily. So when we're talking about paying for these products, a lot of what we've talked about in some of the discussions around IP and tech transfer offices is that the IP, the technology is handed off in the early preclinical stages. That is not the case for contraception. It is paid all the way through phase 3 and then licensed to pharma. So this is me being a little snarky, and God bless AI generated images. So basically my vision is that you have pharma at the end of the pipeline waiting to catch these products and price them with the calculus that they use for their own products that they've done all the R&D on. So sometimes this results in drugs that are 700% times the cost of goods. And it's just, ridiculous. So, and despite negotiations, the products that were paid for instance, by international aid agencies, were not able to be procured for the communities they were meant to serve. So to this day, some of those products are not available broadly. So the field is still stuck in this mindset of what can we do to woo pharma? Like the traditional path is the only way. So even in these models, best case scenario, you have tiering of pricing, which we just talked about. So you're charging folks in Western societies more, which isn't fair either. We have people who are in need here as well. So even when you do have the tiered pricing model, sometimes it takes decades. We just did a big parallel introduction study last year to get these products on the market. So yes, they'll focus on the developed markets, and then eventually they'll get to it. So efforts to stimulate demand and competition have largely been through market shaping efforts like access initiatives, volume guarantees, those sorts of things, but those aren't sustainable methods. And I've got 1 minute left. Okay. So I'm going to pitch really fast here. So these are the last 2 slides that I have to pitch to you guys. So what's the opportunity? We have a global unstaked market that addresses a significant public health need, a sector that's funded exclusively by public and philanthropic entities, lack of immediate interest from pharma companies, VCs. So there's a lack of funding, but we can always work around that. Male contraception is viewed as a subprime asset by many tech transfer offices, which gives us a lot of negotiating power. And then the next question that we're trying to address is how do we maintain our control or influence to maintain mission-driven pharma? So global access clauses are sort of the go-to now, PRIs, things like that. But how can we think bigger? And that's my big point, and it's hidden under there, but it's flipping the model. I showed you the market research data. If we were to go with that market data, we should be going to developing countries first. So what would happen if we went and, oops, let me go back here. What would happen if we went to the developing countries first? We could build the capacity that was spoken about earlier. We could have regulatory introduction take place and start in these developing countries, LMICs, have the clinical studies there, and then build the capacity to do the manufacturing there. It could be a complete reversal of how the current system works. I think that the potential is there. And I think that the minds in this room can help the 5 of us at MCI think through this more. So that's what I was really excited to come here today and talk to you guys about, is like, just come at us, give us any ideas you have, because we need brain power, we need experience, we need better slides than mine, just ways to communicate this better. We also have a big focus on youth. I have to say, you know, just as we were just talking about, I'm keeping a seat warm. That's how I view my job until you guys are ready to come and take it, because the next generation, you do care more, you are more active, and I can't wait to have you guys really running with this stuff. So we have a youth advisory board that works with us from these universities, and we have some high school students as well. I would love to start seeing some sort of collaboration with UAM and really get the youth angle in here. And really, I would love for you guys to present at one of our youth advisory board meetings to just get this insight going with them. So anyway, I'm sorry, I'm excited and nervous. And I was telling Justin, like, I just really am excited to work with you all. You can break the code for our email address criteria, just any of our first names. I'm Heather@malecontraceptive.org. Logan is our research director. Kevin is our communications and marketing director. And this is actually one, I realized I need to dust my desk, but this I got out of a fortune cookie. And I was writing these slides at first, and I looked up and I saw this and I was like, this is what this meeting is for me. Life is never more fun than when you're the underdog competing against the giants. So thank you for having me. And thank you for the work that you do, because the part I forgot to mention, I'm here because of a UAM alumni. Jason Cross, who was here at JHU, reached out to me on LinkedIn about, I don't even know how long ago now. Oh my gosh, it must be almost 10 years ago now, when I was at another job, and got me thinking about the UAM mindset. And it has put me on a whole different path with my career. It is absolutely set how we're looking at how MCI can impact the world. So you guys have a huge impact, and your alumni network is amazing. So your work matters, and I'm really grateful that you're all here. So thank you.
Thank you. All right. So lastly, we're going to wrap up today's series of presentations with Dana Brown, who's Director of Health and Economy at the Democracy Collaborative. And as an established author in her respective field, Dana can speak to the challenges of the current economic system in incentivizing innovation in the pharmaceutical sector. And she'll explain the concept of public ownership as a pathway to counteract obstacles currently faced in a heavily commercialized space today. So with Dana's expertise in this area, I'm going to hand the mic off. And then whenever you're ready.
Yep.
Perfect.
I have no slides, so you guys can ignore the screen, or we can bring it to Kishore if we want him in the room with us. Also, I recognize it's the end of the day and people are tired. Hey, feel free to stand up, stretch, move around, dance while I'm talking. You can't distract me. I'm just really excited to be here. I love UAM. I love talking with you guys. I always learn something. You're a spectacularly smart and motivated and motivating group of people. So it's really a pleasure to be here. Real quick, show of hands. Who's heard of public pharma before today? Okay, that's awesome. Quick show of hands again. Has the US public sector, the government, ever developed new drugs? Oh, interesting. I'm going to dispel that myth. We'll come back to that. Real quick, just shout out, no hands. What might the advantages of public pharma be? Anything?
Transparency.
Oh, cool. What else?
Take power away from pharma.
Oh, I love it. Anybody else? Affordability. Yeah, great. Any other thoughts? Feel free to jot stuff down as I'm talking too. Okay, we'll circle back to this. And then last, what?
Supply.
Consistent supply. Awesome.
I was gonna say innovation for the sake of innovation.
Oh, interesting. Okay, I love it. This is all fantastic. I'm going to try to cover a few of these things. Anything I don't cover today, you can follow up with me. I've got my card here. Justin can send around my email. And then last thing, I'll ask you if you've got any brain power left while I'm talking, before I get there, if you can jot down anything that you think might be a challenge to building a robust public sector, public pharmaceutical sector in the United States. right? Okay, so we're going to talk about some of the advantages, what might some of the challenges. So super quick, why do I care about public pharma? Well, let's talk really briefly about the sort of issues with innovation that we have with the current pharmaceutical sector. We've talked a lot about that today with specific examples, but I want to give a real quick global overview. So my personal central preoccupation with the pharmaceutical industry stems from analysis that many of the issues we currently see, like a decline in clinically meaningful innovation, sky-high prices, recurring and increasing numbers of shortages of essential medicines, increasing post-market safety issues, and regulatory capture, something that we can come back to. All of these are the natural outcomes of an industry oriented around the singular goal of maximizing profit. That focus on primarily short-term returns creates incentives that aren't always in alignment with public health goals, equity, or even macroeconomic goals. The very ownership of the institutions of the industry and the intellectual property that it produces are a defining feature that heavily influences outcomes, right? Why do we get certain drugs and not others? Why are they priced a certain way, right? So what does this current ownership model in pharmaceuticals get us as a country? The current industry is dominated by highly financialized large firms with significant market share and thus little competition, right, in certain therapeutic classes. What does that produce for us as Americans or for residents of this country? So first, we have a highly extractive industry, and Dr. So started to talk about this, right? We get a huge diversion of capital, and the economists in the room, we get a huge diversion of capital away from production and consumption and value-added services and towards capital gains. That is, we're putting a lot of money into making money for money rather than making stuff like medicine. We can get into that further later, but there's some great work by folks like Bill Lazonick and others that show how these big pharma companies are highly financialized and they, quote, routinely distribute more than 100% of profits to shareholders, generating extra cash by reducing reserves, selling off assets, taking on debt, and laying off employees. So they downsize the company where they're supposed to be doing R&D, making new drugs for us, so that they can pay shareholders more money. Is this the best use of our money? Maybe not. What else do we get from the current model? Well, we're double taxed for our medications, right? We talk about that a lot. We pay for the upfront basic research and then we pay for the medications. And you could even sort of say we're triple taxed in the sense that we also heavily subsidize these industries, and often they don't pay the taxes that they legally owe us, right, by offshoring their IP, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, they spend a lot more on marketing than they do on R&D, about twice what they spend on R&D. All in all, there is little public return on vast public investment that goes into developing new drugs. Blah, 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 blah. And so we know that what that results in for us as a country, a quarter to a third of Americans report not taking medications as prescribed due to prohibitive costs, right? The profit-fueled opioid epidemic, which we talked about in another workshop, has decimated innumerable communities. Much of the costly innovation that we get from pharmaceutical industry is clinically meaningless, right? Those Me Too drugs. And of course, drug shortages are on the rise. Additionally, a lack of transparency in the sector leads to economic and scientific inefficiency, with duplication of efforts slowing down scientific processes in the name of firm competitiveness. Again, all of these are the natural outcomes of an industry oriented solely around profit. So to get different outcomes, we need a different design. Once that we see that these, okay, so that's where what we call a public option comes into play. And for me, the work on a public option starts with the assumption that because they're not beholden to shareholders or driven by these market imperatives, public entities, publicly owned and operated pharmaceutical enterprises are free from those constraints of profit maximization and rent seeking, and they can instead define their bottom line in a different way, right? Their imperative can be based on the value of their contributions to public health, to scientific advancement, to local economic resiliency, to securing the supply chain, et cetera, right? Public entities can put a different set of values out there than are we maximizing returns for shareholders? And they have a different timeline too, right? Shareholders, the private market is very focused on short-term returns, whereas the public sector could afford to put in what we call patient capital, where you invest some money now And you might not get a big return. You might not get that output for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. That kind of capital is easier to come by in the public sector than in the private sector. So we can talk more in detail in the Q&A and after about what current proposals are for public farm in the United States. There's a bill that a few of us have that's in front of folks in both the House and the Senate. It's being drafted at the moment, has been introduced. That is for a major new public federal R&D institute that would develop new drugs, prioritizing those with the biggest public health impact and drugs that would help ameliorate health inequities and manage the resulting intellectual property in the public interest and in a transparent way, right? Sort of starting to force transparency on the whole industry by being transparent as a major drug developer and therefore creating some competition. There's also efforts that many of you might have heard of moving forward in several states to begin manufacturing generic drugs in the public sector or in public-private partnerships, right? Who's heard of the fact that California says it's going to bring insulins to market in the public sector and naloxone, and then several other drugs after that. Yeah. So in the future, you could also imagine knitting these two together, right? You can have a federal, you can have regional entities doing full cycle R&D in the public sector, in the public interest, and you can have those working with state level or federal or even municipally operated manufacturing facilities. And you can have regional distributors, right? We can bypass all of that big pharma stuff and get the drugs that people need to them at the prices that are affordable through the public sector. And one thing I really want to emphasize here is that you hear a lot of stuff about cost effectiveness and with drugs. I'd like to propose that there's no reason that we can't treat medicine like a public service, right? Like public education or public transport. Does public transportation make money? Anybody? Does public education make money? No, those are money sinks, right? You have to spend money to hire teachers and build schools, but we do it because the social returns and the economic returns, frankly, are huge. But it's good for us as a nation to have an educated populace and an educated workforce, right? We can invent things. The only reason anyone can invent a new drug is because they've had some time to think and often an education, right? We invest in those things as a country. Why can't we treat medicine like that? Why do we have to say that the medicine has to be, you have to make all of the money back? Yeah, the public sector could afford to lose money. The public sector could afford to invest in things that have social returns. So I have a big fight going on at the moment with the folks in this public initiative in California who are going to bring insulins to market at whatever it was, $35, which sounds great compared to how much insulin costs right now. But as we know from the great work of Melissa Barber and colleagues, it doesn't cost anywhere near that much to produce insulin. Why does the state of California need to make its money back on the insulin or make some profit for their contractors? I don't know, because I would allege that it is socially quite valuable for people to be able to afford their medicine, for people to be able to continue to work, for people to be able to participate in their communities, for diabetics not to be having episodes of ketoacidosis, not to be filling up RERs, having their feet amputated, et cetera, right? There's a bunch of returns to all of us to have a healthy population and focus on things like taking care of others, participating in the community and society, getting an education, going to work. And if I go to work, if I'm able to work, if I'm able to keep myself off disability, I'm paying back to the tax base, which pays for all this stuff anyway. So super quickly, we can talk in detail if anyone has questions about what it would look like to have a public R&D institute in the United States, public manufacturing stuff. Oh, by the way, I promised to spell that earlier. Has the U.S. public sector ever developed medications? Yeah. Yeah, the state of California, the public health department created a treatment for infant botulism, which it continues to manufacture and distribute today. State of Massachusetts, through a company that is completely publicly owned, called Mass Biologics, produces it develops new vaccines, immunoglobulins, monoclonal antibodies. The public health department of the city of New York developed a diphtheria antitoxin a century ago, et cetera, et cetera. So there are a bunch of examples. There are a lot more examples these days in public-private partnerships and all that. But it's a myth that it can't be done or that we don't know how to do it or it's never been done. So very quickly, did anybody, while I was rambling on, come up with any challenges to establishing a robust public pharmaceutical sector in the United States? I think there are a lot of challenges. I think it's worth fighting for. Compensation. Compensation for research is interesting. What else?
I could be wrong, but I would just run off that say pharma.
Yeah, I think pharma would be happy to have the competition. What else?
Corruption.
Interesting. Always possible. Anything can be corrupted. What else? Yep. So I'm gonna start talking a little more. Keep thinking. You can jump. You can interrupt me anytime as you have ideas too. So I've got a couple of things I want to share. Yeah. So the political and economic power of corporations, big pharma included, but not only them. And so the industry pushback that we would expect, I think, would be huge, right? Especially maybe not if the public sector is limiting itself. Oh no. Give me 30 seconds. Okay. My time is up, but I'm going to say a couple of things really, really quickly. So there's political and economic power in the industry. If not established with a clear mission and sufficient democratic governance and accountability mechanisms, public pharmaceuticals could be really vulnerable to politicization. They could suffer periods of disinvestment or succumb to corporatization and a reversion to market-based measures of success. So they could measure their own success by like, how many units did we sell? Did we make back the money? Is that the only way to measure things? No. And in fact, that California initiative, right, they promised to bring insulin to market and they've already had a budget cut and they've already had to postpone half of the program. So, right, this happens. This is a real thing. Another thing, so sustaining public financing over time is really hard, right? The electoral cycles always come up, different priorities. And as we know, developing new drugs takes sustained investments over time. Real quick, just the history of new public management and neoliberalism, right? The state has been gutted in a lot of ways, and the state has been taught that the only way to succeed people are like corporations. So there's a lot of dependence on external contractors and on building internal markets and incentivizing competition, when that's not necessarily the only answer to how to get public interest drugs to market. And then lastly, I'd love to talk about this at length if anyone wants to find me afterwards. A shifting culture inside institutions is really, and I think that's a huge and underestimated challenge. So if we wanted the NIH, for instance, to be the federal R&D institute that does full cycle drug development, the culture of that institution has to change, right? Because there's a real dependence on the current way of thinking. The culture of the PTO, the Patent and Trademark Office, the culture of the FDA, right? And several people have talked about examples today. What do you guys do at UAM? Part of what you're doing is trying to challenge the institutional culture at your universities, where there's a learned way of doing things, which is we spin off and the scientists make their own company and they sell the intellectual property, and that's how they make, right? So it's a process, right? People's jobs depend on continuing to do the way they've always done. Budgets depend on it, but also it's ideology. It's a way of thinking. It takes time, and it's a really big, I think, an underestimated problem to think about not only what does the model need to look like in the future, but how do we get there, and how do we staff a thing, and how do we make sure that it's got the capacity to succeed, especially vis-a-vis the power of big pharma. So I'm going to leave it at that because I know we're really short on time, but I look forward to Q&A. And again, please contact me like when you're back at school and you're thinking about, well, how does public pharma link up at our university, and how can we contribute, and how can we manage intellectual property in different ways? Would love to continue the conversation. I always learn as much from you guys as anyone could ever learn from me. So thank you so much.
All right, so I think what we'll do is, because food should be ready pretty shortly, we'll take a couple questions for the Q&A. So I don't know if we want to do this, if all the panelists could please join us out in front, and then I think we'll put Dr. Wasan also on the screen just in a second. So I'll step over here. Does anyone have any questions for us to open with? Otherwise, something I think that was really interesting to me actually is in terms of this idea of public pharma, how that would look. Because we have mentioned that it has worked in the past in instances, for example, in Brazil. What it would look like if we were to make a transition in the States or, for example, Canada. And is that something you can do on like a product by product basis, or is that something more of a larger movement that's going to follow?
Everybody could probably contribute to this answer, but I'd say, so yes, and is essentially the answer. The answer is there are a million ways it could work. And so part of that strategic, how might we start? Where do we think there's opportunity? What can you build? I think there's some really interesting non-traditional entry points that are maybe not super exciting, but that we could talk about more. I think a wholesale distribution is super ripe for disruption. The wholesale kind of node in the pharmaceutical supply chain is very highly concentrated. There's essentially 3 wholesalers, and there's all sorts of issues with that. Having a public wholesaler to break that up and create competition, but also be transparent. If a wholesaler, public wholesaler, like a state or a region, or even a city said, we're going to function as a wholesaler for medications and distributor around our region, and we're going to publish the prices. We're going to publish what we buy for and what we sell for. Then we magically know what the margins are, like the stuff that you can't get until it comes out in a court case. We're always talking about transparency. Public sector can force transparency by doing the thing and being transparent about it. So that's one thing. And just really quickly, a bunch of countries, including the US at different times in history, have successful public pharmaceutical operations in R&D, in production, in distribution, and they've all done it in different ways. There's places that have federal labs, regional labs, state-owned, different. There's partnerships. There's a lab in Poland that is public/worker owned, and the workers that run that, are on the board, et cetera. There's a whole bunch of different ways that you can imagine it. And I think what we collectively have to do is figure out strategically where are the openings in the United States? Where do we go first? R&D is like the biggest point of leverage, but it's maybe not where the doors open right now. So is there another place we can push? That's the way I think about it.
I think it's a great question. And a public pharma in many ways offers the promise not only of transparency, because if you're paying for it actually as a public sector, you certainly will know what the input costs are. So you'll know what the output should be set at. And it also can help you remove some of the costs that we don't really wish to pay. So we may not actually consider it to be a societal priority, for example, to financialize the pharmaceutical sector, to enrich the C-suite, or to actually increase remarkable returns to actually shareholders of these companies. Instead, we might provide the priority on public health. And there are distinctively different approaches. So in places like Brazil, a parastatal government-owned entity may be fine, whether it's pharma ginkgos or biopharma ginkgos actually for their respective work on drugs or on vaccines. Butantan, which also does actually state level work, for example, on vaccine production in Brazil. But in places like the United States, where we oftentimes need to see private sector engagement, there are also models. And the nonprofit, of course, approach taken by CivicRx, which is also one of the ways which California might operationalize its efforts to publicly produce medicines like insulin. It's really important for us to understand, because even in a US capitalist tech system, we can also create nonprofit generic companies or nonprofit pharmaceutical companies to in fact take on some of this. And very interestingly, what I didn't get a chance to point out was that CivicRx is importantly a major shift in the way in which we think about who should be owning the means of production. It is actually the healthcare delivery system that's owning the means of production. This marks a very interesting economic innovation because it vertically integrates the ownership of pharmaceutical production into the hands of the healthcare delivery system. And in fact, if we actually create these kind of nonprofit approaches, it means that also that the people who own that actually means of production have no real incentive for pricing way above marginal costs. They're going to want to price close to marginal costs, close to what actually makes it affordable for them as healthcare delivery system to deliver it at as affordable price as possible, because it's on them. And so that's the kind of setup in some ways that's very innovative to see. We need many more than just one CivicRx, of course, to get this kind of job done. And we're going to need to see some proliferation of models actually to see how best to do it. But this is, of course, a very promising development. In areas like antibiotics, where we don't want to sell too many antibiotics because You sell more antibiotics, you get more drug resistance, right? And so oftentimes you want to have the right, of course, point between supply and demand. This is exactly the kind of model. And in fact, the first 2 drugs contracted by Savgarx for antibiotics, daptomycin and vancomycin. And so again, this is the kind of model that actually, in my mind, speaks to the notion of public pharma.
Can I jump in there?
Yes, please.
As the only pharmaceutical scientist on the panel with 20 former graduate students in big pharma, let me speak up and make the following comment. So the Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative are former pharmaceutical scientists and big pharma people that have come together to develop medicines at below cost and nonprofit, but using the open model of pharmaceutical sciences. And they get their funding from governments, from the WHO and organizations like that. They've got DNDi is in Brazil, in different parts of the world, and that model has worked extremely well. They just celebrated their 20-year anniversary. So I think there's opportunity here, but I think that there is still a lot of work that needs to be done. But they have been highly successful in developing affordable medicines at or below cost for developing world indications.
I certainly don't have the depth of knowledge as my colleagues, but I will say, sort of coming from the other angle of trying to broach into this space, it's really challenging to realize how much is out here. And, we're trying to figure out a path. We are a nonprofit. We've talked to our board. Is the answer for us to become a drug developer? And so I feel like our immediate network is really challenged and has no visibility. So to come here and sit in this room and hear like this world of opportunities is truly mind blowing. And so again, nothing to contribute other than to say that I think that you're 100% right. There's opportunities that are out there that can come in and contribute to these models. And it also addresses the challenges with foreign aid, like the issues that are out there. These are products that are being funded by foreign aid and sort of don't have a sustainability model. You need something behind it and as an infrastructure. So I just think that making the networks to find out what else is out there that can contribute to these civic organizations is really exciting to think about.
Can I add one more point, if you don't mind? Yeah, sorry, if I sound like the voice of something from somewhere. 20, yeah, my apologies. 25 years ago, when I got involved in neglected global disease research, I was very upset because there wasn't seemed to be models of how to bring different groups together or funding mechanisms. Actually, there was just the Gates Foundation back then, and the Clinton Foundation and initiative had just started. But I've got to tell you guys, I have an optimistic view of the world now, because there are new organizations like the Wright Foundation out of Korea, the GHIT Fund out of Japan, and many others that are working together. And it's a combination of nonprofits, government, grant funding organizations, WHO, and even big pharma, even pharmaceutical industry, have come together to put resources together to develop medicines, essential medicines, at or below cost for certain neglected tropical diseases. And so I throw out to the UAM group, look up these organizations, the Wright Foundation, the GHIT Fund, etc., because they're actually now available to fund some of the things I heard today on this, and I've only been on this small panel, that might be of interest to you. And I'll keep quiet now, but I thought I'd throw that out there.
I think what Dr. Ozan makes a great point, particularly the project development partnership, of course, that has evolved over the last 20-some years. And important, I think that, Heather, you understate actually the importance of your area, because in many ways we have markets that are simply neglected because they don't generate necessarily the kind of revenues that are expected by the opportunity costs that the pharmaceutical industry realizes in areas like oncology, right? Let's face it, even antibiotics can't compete against oncology drugs, and who sets those prices for oncology drugs? Well, it's the pharmaceutical industry that's lobbied very extensively, obviously, to allow for the kind of unfettered pricing of some of these products, and it has very little relationship to marginal cost of production. So that's the big challenge, right? But these both disruptive markets and non-disruptive markets, these paying markets and non-paying markets, We need to find a way in which to create a system of innovation that results in access. And that means really re-engineering the system.
Dr. So makes an outstanding point, colleagues, because I've been in the infectious disease area for 25 years. There has not been any good new novel infectious disease drugs in systemic fungal infections since the late 1990s. And the reason why, as Dr. So said, big pharma doesn't see a market for making profit. Why cancer drugs, and I do prostate cancer work as well, they do. So and the pandemic actually reawoke, I think, people around the world about the importance of drugs for infectious diseases, because that pipeline is basically empty. And part of the reason why it's empty, it's not because of the lack of innovation, it's because big pharma didn't saw the lack of profit. And that is a huge, huge issue. Now I will shut up, I promise you. Thank you.
How much time do we have?
Well, dinner is here.
If anyone has any questions, I can open the floor as well. Otherwise, I think. Yeah. Oh.
Okay. Just to touch on your point, Dana, I think what you said about changing institutional culture really resonated with me, and I feel like my experience, however limited in this type of advocacy, is that that's one of the major roadblocks to like creating change, because convincing people on the other side to want to do the right thing is like really difficult. And so often, like, I feel like we focus on, the policy side, like not convincing them culturally, but more just like forcing them through like the law. And so I was wondering what your experience has been like trying to fuel that cultural change, and like if you had any advice for how we should do it.
Yeah, that's a huge question, and I don't purport to have the answers. I think it'd be a great discussion. If a group wants to coalesce later, we can talk about it. But I think it's a long-term process. And I think a big challenge here is there's a very well consolidated dogma about how things are done, right? How we get new drugs. The public sector puts out a lot of money, and the private sector runs trials, and they bring them and that is deeply ingrained in the institutional memory of the NIH and the PCO and the FDA. So that I think is going to take a while to change. I guess one thing that I try to do is to look for opportunities, right? Where are there places where we can begin to do and convince people because we're doing it, not because they think it's possible or it isn't, you know what I mean? Like in a lot of ways, I think, we don't have time to win the ideological war. We're never going to win over like the popular opinion poll. The issues are too weird and it's all too difficult to explain, and et cetera. And we're a very ahistorical society. People don't know or care that we did this in the public sector in the past. Like most vaccines were developed in the public sector for 150 years, et cetera. We're not good at that kind of stuff. So things like the California, experiment in public manufacturing and whatever, I think are huge opportunities to sort of start to change culture because it's being done in one way or another. And then all of us sort of claiming and retelling the stories of like the NIH Moderna vaccine, right? A lot of this first really important vaccine was developed in the NIH, and the NIH kind of handheld Moderna and walked into the process of getting FDA approval. So the public sector can. Like, we do that. We actually have experience to do this. So I think some of it is storytelling, some of it is doing, some of it we can legislate, right? I think we could create new institutions and give them a new mandate and give them the budget to get things done, but there would then still be work to get the right people in those positions, support them, and begin to change that culture. So I don't think there's an easy answer to that one, but hopefully there's some starting points. If anyone else wants to throw anything else in there.
All right. I think then we will conclude this session. If I could get another round of applause, though.